Hope you had a lunch hour. I think that there was some networking going amongst parents, and then a few people went to sessions, so hopefully you had a good lunchtime and you're now refreshed and full of energy for the next presentation. I'm very, very pleased that we have Joe Trovato here today. Although he's talking in his professional capacity in terms of his role at Erinoak, my relationship with Joe is through, first of all, the Minister's Advisory Council on Special Education, which currently Joe chairs for the province. So he and I, our terms overlapped. I was previously on MACSI for representing physical exceptionality. In addition, Joe was one of my SEAC reps. So he was representing Easter Seals on the Halton Catholic District School Board SEAC. So we know each other very well, and I was very pleased when he accepted the invitation to come and be here today. So I'll hand it over to Joe.
So again, I'm with Louise. It's not about me getting through the presentation. It's about making sure that whatever questions you guys have, that we'll try to answer. And if I can't answer them today, I will get back to you for sure. And a lot of what I'm going to say, by the way, has already been kind of said already, because we're all kind of on the same page here, right? It's about how do we kind of engage in the process in a positive way, understanding that it's not about what we want as parents, it's not about what the school board wants as educators, it's about what we all believe is in the best interest of our children, our students, okay? And I think most of the time, we're usually on the same page. I was curious, oh, here we go. Technology, you gotta love it. I was interested to see kind of the Easter Seals, like what Easter Seals does. Easter Seals Ontario provides programs and services to children and youth with physical disabilities across Ontario to help them achieve greater independence, accessibility, and integration. So that's what Easter Seals does for kids with physical disabilities. So what is it that we think the school board should do? Well, I think what your school board can do is do exactly what Easter Seals is trying to do, and that is to help them achieve greater independence, accessibility, and the only thing I would kind of change is not integration more than full inclusion. They have to be included as part of the day-to-day practices in any school that they're in. And obviously for kids with significant physical issues, the real issue is making sure that all available resources create the optimum accessibility for the individuals, physical, learning, and social environments both receptively and expressively, so as to help actualize their full and true potential, not the potential that's compromised by the challenges, right? Or the lack of accessibility, or that they're doing things that they wouldn't necessarily have to do if their environments were fully accessible. Because what tends to happen with kids with physical issues is, unlike their normally developing counterparts who are doing a lot of things on automatic pilot, a lot of the kids with these physical issues have to kind of plan things out, are always kind of thinking about how they're gonna get from point A to point B and all of that stuff. And what tends to happen over time, if their environments are not fully accessible, that physical fatigue kind of morphs into cognitive fatigue, and now all of a sudden they're not listening to what they need to listen to, nor are they responding to what they're being asked to respond to. And so for me, the key issue is accessibility receptively, i.e. that they have to very efficiently get their learning, but also expressively in the sense that they have to have ample opportunity to express what it is that they would be able to express based upon the knowledge base that they have, that is not compromised by having to use a lot of the physical energy in other ways. What available resources? Well, community partners, school health support services, the psychoeducational assessment process, the IEP process, the IPRC process. Now, you heard a lot of this stuff already, so I'm not going to kind of get into the weeds too much because I think Louise did a pretty good job of giving you the kind of overview. But I do want to kind of look at resources that you could access in order to help you with that planning of how things are going to happen for your sons and daughters in the most efficient and effective way possible. Now, I'm really blessed. I work in a children's treatment center where, like, my role, actually, maybe I should tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a psychoeducational consultant at ErinoakKids. And so I have 3 responsibilities there. One is to do the actual assessments, and I'll talk a little bit about that. 2, to conduct parent workshops, because I'm a firm believer that in order to kind of consent in an informed way, you need to know the information so that you can ask whatever questions you need to ask in the way that you need to ask them. And by the way, that's the key, is that you just wail away. You ask any question that you need to ask, because you wouldn't ask the question if you didn't need to know the answer. So you're not wasting anybody's time. Any question is a good question as far as I'm concerned. It's interesting because there are some really kind of interesting experiences that I've had that have led me to where I am today. The first one was, I wasn't born in this country. You can tell by the O at the end of my name that it's probably Italian, and it is Italian. And so my mom and dad always said to me, listen, if you want to be successful, you have to have a good education, right? Well, I used to get up every morning and walk to school, and I'd see this guy sitting on the curb. His name was Roger. And I couldn't figure out, why is it that it's important for me to go to school, but he's sitting on the curb having fun while I'm going to school and not always having fun. Anyways, it turned out, of course, Roger, God bless him, was in those days mentally retarded. And in those days, school boards had the option of either taking Roger or not taking Roger. And in this case, nobody was going to take Roger, so Roger basically sat on the curb. So I thought, well, now this is kind of crazy. So long story short, I started volunteering. Anybody from London here? Okay, CPRI. So I started volunteering. In those days, it was a Children's Psychiatric Research Institute. Started volunteering, got a good exposure to lots of differences, including autism, although we didn't call it autism then. Certainly lots of kids with behavioral issues, physical issues, you name it, they had it. And all of that on-the-ground experience led me to believe that probably this is the place that I really need to eventually come to. Well, as it turns out, I got talked out of that place because there was this beautiful place that was opening up in Oakville, Ontario. The Oaklands Regional Center, the wave of the future, not a Schedule 1, not a Schedule 2, a Schedule 3, and the only one of its kind in those days. And it was supposed to be kind of this finishing school for, again, kids with mental retardation. And then as it turns out, lots of our clients that ended up at Oaklands were not the clients that were supposed to end up at Oaklands, and everything started to go south. And that's when I decided that I would probably like to set up my own service, and part of it was I needed a community board, and that's how I got to know the Credit Valley Treatment Center for Handicapped Children, which is now ErinoakKids. Plus, I'm also the parent of one of these kids with physical/developmental disability, who, by the way, is going to be 20 on Friday, and who has very much benefited from those community resources out there and all of those partnerships between education and community resources and stuff. And through his Ontario Disability Support Program, he's been able to get employment. And through Developmental Services Ontario, he gets a good stream of funding that affords him the opportunity to get out there in the community and volunteer wherever he wants to volunteer. So he volunteers at the Humane Society, because, and the job that he got, by the way, was at this place called Four Paws, that make cat biscuits, dog biscuits, clothing, all that stuff. So, it all does come together as long as everybody is as much as possible on that same page. And building the assets based upon natural motivation, interest, all of that stuff. So obviously, one of the things that we look at as kind of significant partners is other parents and youth with physical disabilities, because those are the people that are living our lives, especially some of the youth with physical disabilities who can then retrospectively kind of tell us, hey, listen, when you guys offered this kind of training and program and support, like that really helped me because it led me to think about this and think about that and all of that stuff. Because a lot of that practical information is sometimes more important than all of that other highfalutin stuff that we talk about, all these kind of laws and all these kind of statutes and all, it still means that you have to translate it on the ground. And the people that can do that are people who have lived it. Easter seals, obviously. Children's treatment centers, again, wherever you live, right? Your children's treatment center is a good place to kind of hook up and get a lot of information. District school board resources, again, school boards across the province have different kinds of resources, but they're all focused on the same kind of pathway, the same kind of outcome. We've got to empower these children and youth with whatever resources they need to go down whatever pathway they choose to go down. And again, sometimes as parents, we kind of have this bias that if you're not going to college or university, you're just not going anywhere, as opposed to focusing in on whether you're going to college, university, or work, or day programs. It's still about actualizing that potential, whatever that potential is. Because I think I was saying earlier, there's lots of people out there with big IQs and fancy degrees that aren't necessarily as productive as they need to be, or they're in jail or whatever, right? So it's not always about that more than it's about whatever God has given you, that you use it as productively and efficiently as you can. Special education advisory committees, again, every school board in this wonderful province of ours has a special education advisory committee, and Easter Seals has representatives on that committee. And disability-specific agencies like the Ontario Federation of Cerebral Palsy, for example. Again, everybody kind of comes together, provides whatever piece of support that's required out there, and then you put all those pieces together into that wonderful puzzle that will help you and your children move forward. How do I start the conversation? Again, I think Lynn referred to this, but you really don't want to go to meetings and stuff thinking on your feet, right? Because oftentimes, nobody's going to expect you to be the person in that room that's going to be the most objective. On the other hand, and I think Lynn alluded to this too, I can't imagine that anybody knows your kids better in this universe than you guys, okay? So we have to make sure that all of your expert knowledge is available to educators so that they can be the best educators they can be with respect to how they are going to educate our sons and daughters. And so again, it's about, putting those pieces together. So critical background information that will increase understanding, challenges that need to be positively managed in the best interest of the student, documentation of strength, supportive strategies that have been known to work, relevant assessment information, because sometimes, we're sometimes reluctant to give up, assessment information. Now, mind you, you're always in control of that information, but sometimes the assessment information does kind of illuminate stuff for educators. And then your vision of what that education environment would best look like for your child. Because again, you've got that expert knowledge, whereas teachers might change every year, we don't. It's a continuous process for us. And so, our building of information is not interrupted. Our building of information is continuous. School health support services. For this kind of group, school health support services is a key component. Now, it's going to be interesting, again, I think Louise alluded to this, but it's going to be interesting to see what this all looks like when the special needs strategy comes into play, which it should be coming into play pretty soon. It's supposed to be delivering in the spring of 2016. But the key component of the special needs strategy is that you don't have to tell your story over and over and over again to all these different people that somebody from this community agency or that community, or from the school or from CCAC or from, it's good. That's supposed to all come together so that you've got an integrated service where everybody's going to know our sons and daughters for who they really are, not who we all think they are. And that those services will be focused very much so in an integrated way to address the kinds of issues that we see as critical to address in order for that individual to move forward.
How is confidentiality and consent being addressed?
Through the special needs strategy?
Yeah.
Again, there would be, a central kind of coordinator person, and that person would be the key person that would establish all of those things, right?
But just to speak to that, the confidentiality is still going to be respected.
Yes.
So it's only going to be sharing of information that you consent to be shared.
Right.
And as always, you need to know who it's being shared with.
Right.
So I don't know if any of you went to the session this morning on the single plan of care approach that's used by the York Children's Treatment Network. And then they talk about different people having different access to different parts of the plan. So it's not that everybody gets everything.
No.
It's people get the piece they need to know,
Right.
but with your consent. Thank you.
And that consent is very specific in terms of the information, but also the person who gets access to that information. And again, this is all kind of still in process, but by the end of, by the summer, it should be all in place. And
For next year. The actual goal is April 1st, 17.
That's changed then, because it was supposed to be April 1st, 2016. Interesting. Well, these processes always take longer than they're supposed to anyway, so I guess that's no big surprise, right? But I think the overall focus of it, though, I think is beautiful. That again, you don't have to keep telling your stories over and over and over again, that there is a central kind of repository of key information that people can access with your permission whenever they need to access it. But certainly in the context of this population and in the context of accessibility, these people are your key people, the therapists. So through school health support services as it is now, you can access occupational therapy, physiotherapy, speech therapy. If, like my son who has a G-tube, if you need bolus feeding during the day or whatever, then a nurse comes through that service as well. Or if you need specialized equipment, these are the people who will prescribe it and who, in most cases, will cover the costs. So this is a key, I think, part of that programs and services package. What about a psychoeducational assessment? Again, if we're looking at kind of what the possibilities are for any individual, it's not about their physical disability, it's not about their autism, it's not about their kind of clinical medical diagnosis. It's how that translates into the potential to learn within education. And again, I'm very blessed in terms of where I work, because a lot of times I can partner with our assistive devices resource service where there is an occupational therapist, where there is a physiotherapist, where there is a speech therapist, where there's a communication facilitator. Like, we can really set up the assessment to be, sorry guys, to be, I should probably turn this darn thing off. But let me make sure it's not my wife that's trying to get me. Here, I'll turn this thing off there. So it is, by the way, my son put that train whistle on here because when I was younger, I used to work for CN Railways. In fact, they paid basically for me to go to Western and earn my psychology degree. So he figured this was payback to them for being so kind. Again, I'm very blessed in the sense that I can create accessibility to assessments that other people, say in the school system and stuff, may not be able to do. Because, again, sometimes what happens too is we have to break standardization, which we really don't want to do, but in some cases we need to, because it's more about making sure that we all understand what the possibilities are here, rather than the process that gives us the possibilities. But in any case, the focus of psychological assessments are very clear, and there's typically kind of key components. We really want to look at the individual's diagnostic status that will tell us about the developmental trajectory and whether it's typical or atypical. Because again, too many times, and I say this with the utmost respect, too many times, and I know it happened with our guy, people have some very stereotypical views of what that kind of intellectual potential may be of somebody who is in a wheelchair and nonverbal. And so we have to kind of break through those stereotypes and talk about not the presentation always, more than how the potential can be actualized by dealing with the presentation in a positive way. And so my role in that assessment is to identify learning strengths, to identify learning challenges, to look at how that potential is actualizing itself in the academic stream, because of course educators want to know about academic achievement, reading, writing, math, listening comprehension, oral expression, all of those things that would be mainstream requirements in a learning environment. And then we look at kind of what does what we've just discovered mean in terms of what we should be recommending relative to interventions that need to go on, if not daily, at critical moments. And again, there are recommendations. Like, we can't make people do things, right? They still have to be translated within the context of a school system or a school or a classroom. And given that, I've spent a good part of my life not only at ErinoakKids but also in mainstream education, I kind of get it from their perspective too. And so, I can understand or try to be as practical as I can in the context of the recommendations that I'm making, knowing what the system looks like out there, but also to make the recommendations from the perspective of who that individual is and try and move the system a little forward in being a little more accommodating. So the assessment components. There are typically 4 components that we kind of investigate, we try to look at. So the first component is, in fact, establishing the potential for learning. And that potential for learning can be anywhere from the perspective of somebody having a developmental disability to being gifted. Now, the interesting part of that spectrum is that whether you're developmentally disabled or gifted, your requirements for learning are almost the same. and they relate to two central issues. One is that the environment is there, consistent with who you are as a learner, and that where you need differentiation in that learning environment, it has to happen. So both of those diagnoses are out of the normal population. Developmental disability is significantly below the normal population. Gifted kids are significantly above the population. So gifted is the top 2% in terms of the population. Developmental disability is the lower 2% of the population. And then everything in between. So the group that Lynn represents, learning disability, is the biggest population. And the major issue with kids with learning disability is that their learning potential is pretty normal, but they have very specific challenges, whether it's reading, whether it's writing, whether it's math. But interestingly, that's a population that's kind of not a visible population in the same way that our physical disability population is. So standing right in front of you, for example, is somebody with a fairly significant learning disability. Would you know that? No, you wouldn't. And the only reason why I got here this morning is because I used my GPS. Which, by the way, my wife, God bless her, bought for me because she was sick and tired of me calling her and saying, I'm at the corner of and I don't know where I'm going. And she programmed the GPS so that it would never show me a map because I couldn't read a map to save my soul, but it tells me where to go in a very nice way. So for a lot of these kids that we talk about that are exceptional learners, it's trying to establish those GPSs for them that will help compensate for their disability. Because like Lynn said, your learning disability never goes away. Your physical disability won't go away. Your developmental disability won't go away. Your autism won't go away. Your mild intellectual disability won't go away. Your well, you saw all of those 12 pieces that we were talking about earlier. None of those things go away. And what's critical, though, is that we develop GPSs so that if they don't go away, we can compensate for the disabling aspects of the disability so that it becomes less disabling and that the GPSs become more enabling for you. So the first piece is that IQ piece. But even beyond that, what's more important is not how big the IQ is, more than who that individual is as a learner, and based upon what we know about that individual as a learner, how do we set up the GPS? Now, you're all, I'm assuming, parents of kids with physical disabilities, right? No?
Bit broader.
Bit broader? So what do we have?
Mentioned with ASD.
ASD, autism, LD.
Rett syndrome, which is...
Yeah, no Rett's, well, we have a few.
Yeah.
Okay, so really, it's not about the ASD, well, it is about the ASD, it's not about the LD, it's about how do we use that potential and know how that person with LD is learning or is more comfortable learning. So in my case, given that my learning disability was nonverbal, again, you can't be showing me things because I ain't gonna get it. And if you're gonna show me stuff, you better talk to me about what it is I'm seeing because otherwise I ain't gonna get it, right? But then you've got the language-based LDs where you're not gonna talk to me about it. You're probably gonna wanna show me, right? You're probably gonna want to, while you're talking to me, actually show me what it is all your talk means for me in terms of what I need to do about what it is you're telling me about. That first piece, that establishing the potential for learning is all about that. If you were going to teach me something brand new, how would you teach me? Knowing that I have a nonverbal LD, how would you teach me? If you were going to teach me something brand new? You're probably going to tell me. And if you're going to show me, you got to tell me while you're showing me. Right? Most kids with physical disabilities, typically, and I'm one of the people that's doing the assessments for this new CPNet study, where we're looking at who these kids are typically as learners. And what we're starting to find out is that they are typically more talker and listener kind of learners than they are seer and doer kind of learners, because their physical disability hasn't allowed them to negotiate their physical environments in such a way that visually and spatially they would have an appreciation of what their world looks like at that level. So that's the first piece. Yeah?
Can you help me out with something? Is the term nonverbal and verbal, as I'll call them,
So language-based
yes,
versus non-language-based.
is that similar to nearsighted and farsighted, but it's actually the opposite?
Oh, that's interesting.
You know the way?
Yeah, kind of, in the sense
I
that...
find it confusing.
Yeah, it is, in the sense that, for example, and again, this is kind of oversimplifying, but if you were to cut my head open right now, my right brain would be the size of a walnut, and my left brain would be pretty big. And that's because, the left side of your brain deals with kind of the language pieces. The right side of the brain is more the visual, spatial kind of stuff. Not very artistic, not very creative, right? Because again, part of that aspect of the disability relates to that kind of stuff.
That's why it has to do with hands, whether you're left or right oriented. The brain.
Well, I mean, there's a little bit of everything there, but when you look at it just from the perspective of IQ-related stuff and the learning style stuff, again, typically left-brainers are more talker and listeners, right-brainers are more seer and doers. But it's not about that, like, directly. It's kind of an oversimplification.
It is kind of.
Well, what she said, how nearsighted, farsighted, because it almost is like two negatives, right? The non-verbal disability, the non and the disability means you do like verbal.
Yeah.
That's your strength.
Yeah, good point,
yeah.
good point.
Thank you.
Yeah, good point, yeah.
Not logical.
It sounds like you have difficulty with verbal stuff. But what it actually means is that's your strength. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying, by the way. So now we know what the potential is, right? And you'll see it typically kind of explained in the context of percentiles, right? So if you're at the 50th percentile, you're about as normal as you can be, because 50% are below you, 50% are above you. And then there are cuts. So the broadly normal population is like low average to high average, then you've got superior, borderline, and just, if you're really interested, Google the normal curve, it'll tell you everything you want to know. Second piece is investigating any developmental barriers, including social and emotional impediments. And so for a lot of students, right, they'll want to be able to do these things, but can't bring themselves to do it because they're anxious or they're just not feeling really kind of confident and positive about themselves as learners, that there are kind of other impediments like attention deficit or all of these things. And again, you have to kind of factor those in order to be able to deal with them positively so that the potential actualizes itself as best as it can without those barriers kind of compromising it. Then we establish an actualized level of achievement, and so we do look at reading, writing, math, all of those things that educators would need to know about so that they can establish whatever it is they need to establish in terms of resources, services, programming, all of that stuff. And then the fourth piece is, never mind how big your IQ is, never mind if you can read or write or if you have anxiety, how do you get along in this world at a very practical level? What is your functional footprint, right? Because again, there are lots of very successful people that are high school dropouts. And there's lots of not so successful people that have advanced degrees that they just didn't know how to use, right? Because of social skill. And when you look at some of the literature out there in terms of what employers, you knew I was going to do that eventually, right? I got it. Okay, we're okay? Okay, so the practical functional footprint is key. And certainly diagnostically, especially for kids where we need to make a diagnosis of a developmental disability, three components are critical. One is that the IQ falls in a certain range, but also that the day-to-day functioning falls in that same range, and that it all started before they turned 18.
How are you measuring the day-to-day functioning? Is it a parent checklist?
Yeah, it's questionnaires. Same with the social emotional pieces. Those are all questionnaires because, again, we have to go out there and get information from the people who know them best on the ground. So it would be their teachers, their parents, right? And then we put it together, and then that tells us kind of diagnostically where the picture falls. So if it's a global kind of situation, then you're looking at developmental disabilities or mild intellectual disabilities. If there are splits, you're looking at learning disabilities. But in any event, whatever it is, there are processes that fall from there in the context of recommendations that you would make going forward. Now, is there any questions about assessments? Yeah.
How often can you ask for one? Like if my kid had one, it was done in grade 3 and the results were given to me in grade 4, and they're like in high school now, is there like a number of years that I have to pass before I can
Actually,
apply for a renewed?
yeah,
Can
somebody
you
was
repeat the
asking.
question?
So the question was, how often and when should you do it? How long do you have to wait before you do another one? That kind of thing. It's, again, the overriding philosophy in this wonderful province of ours is early identification for the purposes of early intervention. I'm a firm believer that you want to do assessments as early as possible because you want to identify those kind of challenges as early as possible because the extent of the challenge very early on may not be the extent of the challenge 5 years down the road, right? If you haven't kind of dealt with it, if you haven't intervened to manage it. But typically in terms of psychological assessments, 2 or 3 years between. So what I usually do is I see kids as early as possible because one of the significant transitions is a transition into school, right? And so if there are pre-existing challenges, you want to make sure that those pre-existing challenges are identified as early as possible so that you can manage the challenges as early as possible so that they don't become more complicated than they need to become. To be crass for a moment, it's like, the dollar we spend today is not the $1,000 we have to spend tomorrow because we didn't spend the dollar wisely to begin with, right? And I think from the student's perspective, if I get my help early and am able to manage that, then I can start developing skills myself based upon the reactions that I'm getting when I use those skills, right? So if I use my GPS and it works out for me and I got here this morning, I'm more likely to use my GPS. If I had used my GPS and I was stuck in Newmarket, I won't say who was stuck in Newmarket this morning, the probability of me using that GPS again drops, right? Because using the GPS wasn't kind of enabling for me. So over time, why would I use the GPS if it's not going to do me any good, right? So, but I think the earlier on you develop those GPSs and use them with an effective outcome, the more that skill is likely to remain and grow. And so the earlier, the better.
That wasn't quite the question. The question was, if I was doing it through school, and I've had one, like, at what point, how much time would need to pass before the school would entertain?
2 or 3 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Only because anything closer than that, then you have to worry about practice effects and preconceived knowledge and all of that stuff. And so your outcomes get a little bit kind of not as reliable as they would otherwise be. Plus, we have critical transition periods. So one critical transition period is coming into school. Then another critical transition period is beyond the early learning and formative years. So now you're moving from learning how to read, learning how to do math, learning how to write, learning all of these skills, and then you're moving into using those skills as your toolbox for learning, right? So you want to kind of look at that summative point, so around end of grade 3, grade 4, and the other critical transition is from elementary to secondary. Assuming that there are learning challenges that need to be tracked in a standardized way. And by the way, one of the biggest growing parts of my practice at ErinoakKids is the transition from elementary to secondary and the transition from secondary to post-secondary. And now I'm moving it down to that transition into kind of kindergarten, grade 1. But if we move it down that far, what happens is now you've got to do more assessments. Because when you do it early, there's so much flexibility in the developmental piece that you need to track it at the end of that early learning and formative time.
Just curious, in your sort of experience or your provincial connections, is there any discussion at a higher level about direction around these psychoeducational assessments? I mean, you're describing a very luxurious environment, right? And certainly I know that I'm in the Simcoe board. I have a child with LD, but also, and I only know that because we have the resources to pay somebody to do that,
Yeah.
right? I mean, in our board, they will not do it before grade 3. Don't even ask. You will not get it less than 5 years in between. You can't ask. And most kids are waiting 5 and 6 years. Like they're getting their psychoeds in grade 7 and 8. And so each school might get 1 a year. And we're told that's the board choice about where they're putting their resources, and that we're told, I don't know if this is true, but that in York Region, for example, it's much easier to get a psychoed. There are more psychologists available to do that. So if that is really a board-based choice,
It is
there no discussion at a higher level to say, hey, it would be great to know earlier and put interventions in earlier, and it's important to know at these transition times? And I'm unclear why that's a board decision.
Well, because boards reserve the right to use their funding the way they think they need to use it, and and again, psychology, social work, speech language, all of those are non-teaching kind of positions, and so some boards don't even have psychology people, or they have very few. Some boards have, a few speech language plus social work. So. The difficulty is, it's a resource difficulty, right? And so...
But that's clearly their equity, the number of their
Yeah.
pillars, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering,
Yeah.
is there some advocacy from the psychology community to say, your dollar spent early on is really going to save a great deal of money?
Yeah, there is. So one of the representatives on the Minister's Advisory Council for Special Ed is psychology. And up until my new position, I was the person represented. And it was all about, doing these assessments strategically, right? And again, from a philosophical standpoint, now that I'm not working in a school board, I mean, my philosophy always has been, and when I sat on SEAC for one of the boards, my position always was, hey guys, we've got to assign resources in terms of our non-teaching staff to foster the provincial kind of philosophy of early intervention and early identification. And I know that in the board, at least they tell me now, because I've left the SEAC, but that in fact they do have designated kind of resources that look at kids very early on. Because ironically, again, the provincial philosophy, the provincial kind of overriding philosophy is early identification for the purposes of early intervention. But again, every board reserves the right to kind of conduct their business in the way that they see that they need to conduct it. So, Board A may not have a special class at all anywhere. Board B has all kinds of special classes. Board A has a whole ton of psychologists. Board B has one or two, right? It's not universal out there because the population, depending on where you live, can be very different, right? And the profile of need and everything could be very different.
Can the CERT not do the academic achievement testing?
Yeah, and I'm not sure why it doesn't happen more often than it does happen.
Because as far as what you want regularly, I would think that would be more, because the diagnosis of autism, it's likely not going to change, but your academic achievement is what's changing.
That's correct.
And your CERT should be able to.
That's why assessments become important, because you kind of have to track that trajectory to make sure that it's heading in the right direction. And if nothing else, that trajectory stays where it is, if nothing else, right? Because then you've established the learning rate, and if the learning rate is supported, then that trajectory stays exactly where it is. If it dips, then something's going on, and that potential is not being supported. So, but again, every board kind of sets it up the way they think they need to set it up to serve the population that they serve within the jurisdiction of that board. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because they do have to serve the community in where that board exists, right? And the way they do it is the way they think they need to do it, and they would only change if they got a whole bunch of feedback and pressure that said, no. And I'll give you an example. Up until very recently, the board that I served on didn't have special classes. And the argument was made that at the point at which you made the decision to do this, did you kind of set the table for everybody, or did you set the table for only those that believed in integration? Right? Because there's no science out there that says take the same two kids and you school them in a regular class with support or in a special class, that the outcomes, we don't have the science. So it's pretty well based upon two philosophies. The one philosophy says, well, I want my child to be schooled in their community because that's the only way their community is going to know them for who they really are, not who they think they are. And the more that community knows them, the more the community will be able to create the appropriate opportunities for them, right? The other philosophy says, no, as much as I want my kid to be normal, he's not. So when he looks out in his class, I want him to see sameness. I want him to know that he's not the only one that has this condition, that there are other people that have this condition, and it's okay to have this condition. The real issue becomes, I think, is when you have these special classes, and if I can kind of defend educators, is, if I've got a class, if I'm a teacher of a class of kids with developmental disability, for example, as opposed to I'm a teacher of a regular grade 3 class. If I'm the teacher of the regular grade 3 class, when I get up in the morning, I know exactly what I'm going to do that day because there's a provincial curriculum that tells me. And that provincial curriculum is designed to increase the probability of a positive outcome at an academic level. If I'm the teacher of a class of kids with developmental disability, and I know that these kids are not going to be on an academic pathway more than they have to be on a functional pathway, when I get up in the morning, the only curriculum that I have to go to is the Ontario curriculum, which is an academically based curriculum. And the other question that you have to ask is, if I'm 12 years old and my reading level is grade 1, what is a grade 1 reading level content going to mean to me as a 12-year-old? It's not going to mean anything, right? And so that's where the individual education plan becomes critical to look at other opportunities of delivering on age-based information that's packaged in such a way that as an individual who is not, whose potential is not age level, how do I access that information? How do I package that information so that I can understand it, even though I'm not at an age 12 level, I'm at an age 5 level? Right? That's the special part of special education, and you look at all kinds of possibilities. I'll give you an example. My son, whose ears are always burning, because I always use him as an example, who, right, how is it that this kid would know, and by the way, he has a significant developmental disability, so he's moderate to mild, okay? How is it that he knows stuff about Harry Potter, the Hunger Games, all of that stuff? I mean, this is not stuff that somebody at his level would really be able to read or understand, right? So how is it that he knows about this stuff? Well, because, A, when we got the Harry Potter books, we got them so that they would be read for him, and all he had to do was listen and ask questions. Or every once in a while he'd say, oh, geez, no, do we have to read it? Come on, why don't we just get the movie?
Yeah.
Right? But as educators and parents, we have to look at these kids as not the typical traditional learners, and then we got to start thinking about non-traditional ways to get to where we otherwise get in a traditional way. And by the way, that's the key of why we would want the psychoeducational input. It's basically to assist educational personnel with the support and involvement of parents. And by the way, support and involvement of parents, it's the ministry's expectation that it's an equal partnership. There are no senior partners here because, again, both parties have key pieces of the puzzle to contribute, right? So, and I often say it's not about what we want as parents and it's not about what they want as educators. It's what we both agree is in the best interest of the kid that we're trying to serve through parenting and through educating. And then to construct and provide the special education programs and services that are required to effectively and efficiently meet individual student needs to help them achieve greater independence, accessibility, and integration to their full and true potential. Again, not the potential that's compromised by the disability. Okay? Programs. We heard all about programs. What are programs? Well, they're based, or they're supposed to be based on and modified by results of continuous assessment and evaluation, and that includes a plan called an individual education plan. And I'll just summarize, because I know Louise kind of went through it, but basically, the key ingredient of the individual education plan, just to take it a little bit further than Lynn did, It's yes, what's in the plan, yes, how you're going to evaluate what's in the plan, and how are you going to know that what the educators are doing is in fact creating assets. But even more so, I think it's extremely important that you know why we're doing this and not something else. Because you have to have the rationale for what's in that IEP. Like, why are we, teaching him this way when we could be teaching him this other way? Why are we teaching him this content and not, say, this other content? And the rationale is usually in the context of what we know this individual to be as a learner. Because otherwise, why would we do it? But then you also have to know not only why we're doing this and not something else, but that what we're doing is creating assets. And that there should be a clear rubric for you to know that in fact there's progress being made. And it's usually related to the expectations of the IEP. But even then, you've got to follow those expectations in the IEP, because if in fact your son and daughter is getting A's and B's related to the expectations of the IEP, then the IEP should be moving forward. Just like in the same way that if your sons and daughters were meeting the expectations of grade 3, they wouldn't stay in grade 3, they'd move to grade 4. And sometimes that's not always, that movement is not always as clear and transparent as it needs to be sometimes. And again, it's the Ministry of Education's expectations that the IEP will be developed in meaningful consultation with parents. Because, again, educators, in order to be better educators, to manage the differences that some of these kids and youth present, you gotta know kind of what the overall life plan is by the parents, but also you need to capitalize on the expert knowledge of the parents. And so it should be kind of an ongoing equal partnership. And by the way, the IEP is not static, it's a working document, right? Just the way the curriculum is a working document, because no kid stands still in their learning. They're always progressing. Services refers to facilities and resources, including support personnel and equipment necessary for developing and implementing the program. So, for example, if in fact I have an individual, I have a son who can't do a lot of speaking for them.
At a time.
Is it 5 minutes?
Yes.
Yikes. That, again, can't decode the words by himself, then we have to have assistive technology that's going to do it for him. Because it's more about accessing the story than it is about reading every word yourself, right? And so that's where the services are supposed to come into play. And of course, one of the key services for kids with physical disabilities would be schoolhouse support services. For kids with learning disability, direct instruction we know is very effective. For kids with autism, we know that applied behavior analysis is a key teaching strategy. So, I mean, the information's all there. It's just a question of accessing it strategically and incorporating it strategically within the IEP as alternative curriculum. By the way, do you guys know the difference between alternative curriculum, modified curriculum, accommodate? So, yeah, I see a lot of, okay, all right. What does the IPRC do? Again, Louise dealt with this, but basically, does a student present an exceptional student, yes or no? And if yes, under what category does that student fall? Communication, autism, is it intellectual developmental disability, what is it? Okay. So those are all the categories. Range of placements fall into two categories. One is regular class as a home base, or Special class is the home base, all right? And again, depending on what board you're in, those options either exist in a certain way or exist in another certain way. Some boards don't have special classes, other boards kind of deal with special classes across the spectrum. Other boards have special education resource program classes, so that it's all about providing the resource to whoever needs it without getting into the specifics of the exceptionality. Before recommending placement in a special education class, and again, Louise dealt with this, you got to make sure that everybody understands the added value of going to a special class as opposed to staying in the regular stream with the support. And the majority of kids out there, students, are in the regular class. This wasn't dealt with this morning, and this is a bit of a controversial area because the provincial schools are being reviewed as we speak, but there is the possibility, depending on, the presentation in terms of very key issues, a provincial school could be recommended, or a demonstration school. The IEP, again, expect to be developed with, in consultation with parents. And again, we want to make sure that there are very specific and transparent and clearly understandable expectations with outcomes, and also very clear expectations with all that process that leads to the expectation that's very understandable and clear to you as parents before you consent to things. Now, if you go on the Ontario Director's website, every IEP that you can ever imagine, an example of which is online. And you can look at those IEP examples, and that'll give you a pretty good kind of practical, kind of on the ground kind of example of the possibilities. By the way, I'll give you all this information, so you don't have to go. I'm going to pull a Lynn Zeraldo. The in-school team meeting or the IPRC, you don't have to go alone. And by the way, it's interesting that people will ask you as a parent, who are you bringing and why are you bringing them? I would suggest to you that as a parent, you also ask the principal, who's going to be at this meeting and what is their role? Because sometimes you do walk into a room full of people and that you don't expect to see there. You want to be prepared factually and emotionally. You want to feel free to ask any questions that will help inform your consent. Again, no question is a bad question. If you wouldn't have asked it if you didn't need the information. Stay focused on the goal of the meeting. Listen actively and agree where you know you can agree. Be assertive, not aggressive. Stand tall, sit, and be prepared to educate, but also be prepared to be educated. What else? And the shared solutions piece, Lynn covered pretty well. Because you can appeal identification and placement, but you can't appeal program, but you can, through this shared solutions, create the opportunity to come to some overall agreement about what's in that IEP.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I'm sorry that I had to...
No, it's okay.
To rush you. I'm feeling bad about that all day because we have so many good speakers, we have so much information to share. It's trying to all cram it in, and we limited each person to an hour, and I'm conscious that we've got one more session to go today. So I'd really like to thank you very much, Joe, for coming. I think that huge valuable information in terms of where the psychoeducational assessment fits in the process. And I think, as alluded to by some members of the audience, there are challenges in some boards in getting those psychoeducational assessments. But you've explained to us how they're key, and I think that that gives us a bit more ammunition in terms of advocating for our child and why there should be an up-to-date assessment. So thank you very much, Joe. Thank you for coming today.